Welcome to Old School Sports and happy OOTP23 release day. One of the big topics over the past month or two in the build up to OOTP23 was the new tutorial system. I've spent some time with that system today. Nothing revolutionary in there, I don't think, for players who are very experienced, but just wanted to share my kind of key takeaways that may help those newer to the game and also those experienced to the game by kind of summarizing what I thought were some of the most interesting items in the 10 different tutorials that the folks at OOTP put together. You can see here, tutorial 1 is the basics, lineups and pitching staffs, team and player strategies, player management, injuries and suspensions, waivers in the DFA system, finances, staff and personnel, player development and scouting, and contract negotiations are the 10 different tutorials that they've put together. None of them are particularly long, so certainly probably worth the time as a refresher if you have the time. But if you're like most people and just want to jump into playing the new game, hopefully this video will give you a Cliff's Notes version of what I thought some of the more interesting takeaways were, things that I had learned in the past and that I got reminded of by going through the tutorials, and then actually some things that I never realized that I thought were pretty useful. So hopefully this is a useful video to both new and experienced players alike. Would love to hear your comments down below, and if you enjoy the video, would appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel and like this video and help others find it. So tutorial number 1 is called Covering the Basics, as they kind of outline right here at the start. It's for brand new players to OOTP. Really just helps them navigate all of the different screens and kind of begin to understand where all of the massive amounts of information in OOTP are located. So if you're an experienced player, I think you're probably fine skipping this one. But if you're brand new to the game, I think this one is a very useful video to spend some time with. To me, the most interesting part of this video is some discussion about the new filtering available in the new mail system. Makes it a bit easier to sort through all of the emails that come through as you're managing a team. Quite honestly, I usually don't subscribe to a lot of that email, so I don't know if it's going to have a huge impact for me. But if you do get massive amounts of email on the league and the teams and your minor league systems, etc., I think that it kind of walks you through the filters here and the different categories involved. Can filter from team emails, player emails, league emails, worldwide emails, etc. So that's kind of the one big change in this section that I noted. So if you get a ton of email and need help organizing them, I think digging through this tutorial a little bit can help give you some ideas on how to do that. Tutorial number 2 covers setting lineups and pitching staffs. A few key takeaways in this one for me as a more experienced player who's been playing for many years. Got a little bit more out of this one than I did out of the first tutorial. Video starts off with pitching and how to plan out your rotation, and then all of the different rotation settings available, which are a good reminder. And as you get further into the pitcher settings and the pitcher tutorial, it does a good job explaining exactly what all of the different potential roles in the bullpen are and how they think about them. So who's your closer, who's your setup, etc. The stopper is obviously a newer innovation in baseball, and that's high leverage situations, so can put a potentially really good pitcher into that role. And they do also clarify the differences between setup relievers and stoppers. Setup relievers usually are just going to go 1 inning. Stoppers can be utilized to go 1+ innings, so you can go multiple innings before a closer with a stopper typically. And then they also talk about a strategy that some others have put videos out about over the past few years in terms of skipping the closer role altogether and just using stoppers. So some pretty interesting information with a little more detail in here about all of the different bullpen roles and how you could possibly leverage them to make your team better, which I thought was helpful. And not surprisingly, the second part of the pitching and lineup tutorial is about lineups, going through similar mechanics of how to set up your different lineups, how to set up the backups, talk about how often you're going to be bringing in backups to start games for them, defensive substitutions, pinch hitting, pitch runners, just a lot of information on some of this stuff that if you are managing the games on a day-to-day basis is pretty important to you. I generally play general manager only, so I let my manager make a lot of these decisions. But certainly if you want to play as a manager and you're relatively new to the game, would definitely suggest going through this tutorial to get a lot more information on how to make those changes and set your lineups up perfectly. And then the last part of this video tutorial goes into the new daily lineups feature, which has been talked about a lot over the past several weeks also. You can set lineups for up to 30 days in advance, and it does let you see who the expected pitchers that you will be playing against all of those days into the future are going to be. And it also gives you some drop downs so that if a pitcher who you think you're going to be facing in a week and a half from now ends up not being the pitcher that day, lets your AI know how to kind of respond and whether you just want to continue with that lineup or adjust it in different ways. So for those who really micromanage their lineups on a daily basis, but don't necessarily want to do that every day, like to set things out for a couple weeks ahead of time, I think it's definitely worth listening to and participating in this tutorial to get some more color about the daily lineups and how to use those. Tutorial number 3 goes over team and player strategies. I found this one pretty useful. It addresses one of the other key additions to the game this year, which are broad team strategies, which we'll get into shortly. But I think that this was a pretty good addition and a tutorial that I got a few takeaways from that I'll share with you now. The key thing this tutorial gets into is broad strategies for your entire team, as well as individual player strategies. And then you have the opportunity when you are assigning your individual player strategies to decide whether they will override your team strategies or kind of adapt to those team strategies. To me, it seems sense that you would make the global team strategies first, and then I think what I will do is have player strategies that only override that. If there's a pitcher who I want to pitch more pitches in a game, potentially as a starter, than a generic limit that I put on my entire pitching staff, or if there is a older player who's very injury prone that I decide I want to be a little more conservative with in terms of fatigue settings. To me, it seems to make sense to use the individual player strategies to override all of the team strategies, but it's customizable to kind of do it either way depending on what you prefer. For example, if I decide my default batting bench fatigue number is 90%, and if someone's 90% or lower in terms of fatigue, I want them out of the lineup. If I have a 37-year-old player who's physically wrecked, I might put that at 95% and then have the player strategy setting override the team strategy setting for that player. So I'm even more conservative in putting him into the lineup when he's banged up a little bit or worn out. They've also got some good information in this tutorial on the strategy sliders. As I mentioned, I tend to let my manager make all of these decisions or most of these decisions. But if you are more of a GM/manager or only manager type player, might be worthwhile going through the tutorial here to get a little more information on those aspects of the game. And then the last portion of this tutorial gets into the individual player strategies, and they start right off making the point that I made before. If your team strategy says to never steal at any point, but you have the best base stealer in the league, you can set a player strategy just for that player to allow them to steal often and override the team strategy. And I tend to think that that's what I would use this for. Going to generally make sure to override with the individual player strategies the overall team strategy. And the way you're going to do that is this mode button right here, which as they describe is the most important setting. And it describes whether you want the player strategies to override the team strategies or adjust the team and player strategies by merging them. My thought is that I'm always going to override the team strategy settings if I'm on this page. But you've got the option to use it either way if you want, and this mode button or this mode drop down right here is how you decide how you're going to go forward in terms of how the individual player strategies you put together interact or contradict with the broad team strategies that you put together. And as many of you probably know, when you get into the roster strategy settings, that's also where you've got the drop down to choose, or the checkbox to choose whether or not you want to use players as a two-way player, and then also discuss how to use or not use them if players are banged up with a day-to-day injury. And if you do have a two-way player, this is also where you would go to check the skip DH when pitching option, which will allow a player a bat is DH even when they're pitching. So the Shohei Ohtani situation where even if he's pulled out of the game as a pitcher, the Angels want to likely keep him in the lineup. And then as you get into the pitchers, you've got the options similar to the batters to adjust all of their individual settings, change them different from what you're doing with the team. If you've got a pitcher who's a lot better or a lot worse, a lot more injury prone, a lot less injury prone, if you want to take him out more quickly than other pitchers, this is the spot where you can make all of those individual adjustments. And this tutorial will give you a lot more information on exactly how to do those things. Tutorial 4 goes into how to demote and promote players, move players from minors to the majors, international rosters. This is one that I think is probably pretty useful for newer players. Not a ton of takeaways from my perspective for more experienced players in this video. The only real takeaway that I had from this video is when they talk about your international complex, and I think it's well known that there's only room for 50 players on an international roster in the default settings. And if your international roster is full, your scout is going to stop discovering new players. So for those who manage every aspect of their minor league system, just a good reminder to make sure that you always keep some open space on your international roster and get rid of the lowest rated players or the players that have the worst personalities, to make sure that you've always got space there open in case your scout finds the next great thing. You want to make sure that they have the ability to actually find them for you and then put them onto a roster. Tutorial number 5 covers injuries and suspensions. Again, this is probably one that's more useful for newer players to the game, but still a couple of interesting reminders and refreshers that I came across that I'll share with you. A good reminder in this tutorial about rehab: when you have a player who has been out with a major injury, if they don't get a rehab assignment in the minors, there's a chance that they're going to re-injure themselves, possibly even more seriously than the first time. So I think it's pretty well known in the community that this is something important to do when players are coming back from longer term injuries. But a good reminder here that if at all possible, try to give your players a rehab assignment in the minors to ease themselves back in and come back from that injury a little more gradually, so they don't end up back on the injured list for an even more extended period of time. And specifically, they point out that serious injuries that take more than a month to recover may be the type of injuries where you want to send the player to rehab to make sure that they are ready to go before they start playing 100% all out on the major league roster. There's also some good information in this tutorial about exactly what your trainer does, the prevention focus, recovery focus, balanced focus, and then all of the different ways that they try to help with rehab and prevention from injuries, as well as fatigue recovery. And they do make a point in here which intuitively makes a lot of sense, but I don't know that I had ever actually specifically run across it in any of the manuals that I had read before. But shortstops, catchers, and center fielders, obviously probably the 3 most demanding positions physically to play from a fielding perspective, are going to suffer more fatigue. So just a good reminder to hopefully have good backups at those positions, particularly if you have players that are already injury prone or older who are manning those roles. And the corollary to that thought is that you have weak depth or stars that you want out there every day at those key positions like shortstop, catcher, and center fielder. Probably makes sense to try to have a trainer who is as strong in fatigue recovery as possible. Tutorial 6 covers waivers, designating players for assignment, the Rule 5 draft. Honestly, if you are an experienced player, I don't think there's too much at all in this. If you're a new player, it is a good one to probably go through, but I didn't find anything in this one that was all that insightful compared to the other tutorials in the new tutorial system. This was also a quick one, just wasn't a ton here, but if you're unfamiliar with waivers and DFA and those terms, it's a worthwhile tutorial to spend a little bit of time with. Tutorial 7, in contrast, which covers finances, is one that I think was pretty useful. It's one of the longer ones, a lot of detail, but if you're overwhelmed by the multitude of different financial options and the accounting screens and what everything means in OOTP, I think this is one that probably has some value for both new and experienced players, depending on their comfort with the financial system in the game. The video does provide some information about the financial summary, and then also budgeting, ticket prices, and then market size, fan loyalty, and fan interest. Interestingly, it does give a good description of fan loyalty. which is how well fans are going to come out regardless of how the team is performing. So that's kind of the stickiness in your attendance and even the stickiness in the number of season tickets you might be able to sell is going to be driven by that fan loyalty number. Now, with a lot of teams, it seems like there's a pretty high correlation between market size, fan loyalty, and fan interest. But I think that understanding these different aspects and the way they work together a little better can potentially help you to generate a little bit of extra money and higher attendance, which, hopefully will contribute to bigger payrolls and bigger budgets and more success on the field over time. This tutorial also goes line through line on all of the different items on the accounting screen. So from that perspective, I think it's a good overview. One point, media revenue and merchandising revenue. They basically acknowledge right in here that those kind of numbers are usually set in stone. They're generally going to stay the same every year, not things that are going to change frequently, and not really things that you're going to have a lot of control over as a manager or general manager. So if people have been racking their heads about how to change those and improve those over the years, a little bit of information in here that maybe you should put your energies into somewhere else where you're going to have a bigger impact potentially. Another good reminder in the accounting section when they talk about draft budgets, as long as you don't have a penny pinching owner like Bob Nutting in Pittsburgh, you can generally go over your draft budget a little bit. But if you've got a penny pincher, you're going to be in big trouble if you need to spend even just a little bit of extra money than what you have budgeted for the draft, assuming that you don't have any additional information, any additional money in your budget somewhere else. And this tutorial also comes out with an explicit recommendation for player development budgets to be between 20 and 30 million for standard major league games. Historically 36 has been kind of the cap on that, but as we'll talk about shortly, it seems that may be a little bit different this year. But it seems like they're definitely recommending, if at all possible, to be in that range to get the most bang for your buck as far as player development. A good reminder here that one of the last lines in the accounting spreadsheet is cash from trades, something I don't do enough, but particularly when playing a small market team. Any little amount of extra cash that you can get when making trades is going to ultimately help those small market teams significantly. So a good reminder to not forget about trying to just add on a little bit of cash, perhaps even in exchange for extra minor leaguer who's not going to amount to anything when you are making trades with other teams, particularly if you are a franchise that doesn't have the same economic resources as the Yankees or the Dodgers or the Red Sox or some of the real big market teams. And the final section of this tutorial gets into your team's salary page and looking out at the contracts that you have for the future and which contracts are guaranteed, which contracts are on auto renewal. Kind of a good reminder to when you get heading into the early stages of the off season, if there's a player who's on an auto renewal contract that you really don't have a future role on the team for, to either release them or trade them away before that auto renewal kicks in, and you're kind of forced to be paying a major league salary to someone that you don't really want on the team for another season. Bigger issue most likely again for small market than big market teams, but a good reminder to be cognizant of those auto renewal contracts. Particularly with minor league players, even if it's someone who's really not in your plans. For example, they might be out of options to be moved back and forth, or they're just never going to be a major leaguer for you. get them off of the 40-man roster and possibly just get them out of your franchise entirely to save some money. Tutorial number 8 covers staff and personnel. I found a decent amount of interesting nuggets in this one, which I'll share with you now. Definitely another one that's great for new users, and even with the change to the coaching system in last year's version of OOTP22, this is one that might be useful for more experienced people who haven't dug as deeply into that topic in the past. One of the first things this tutorial gets into is reputation, and as it says here, reputation's only an indication of how well respected and successful your coach is. So don't make the mistake of simply hiring the highest reputable coach. I think, people familiar with the game kind of know this, but it's good to kind of see it in writing. In this tutorial, note specifically on the next screen that reputation changes over the career. The more years somebody has, the more likely their reputation is going to be higher, and what that means is they're going to demand a higher salary. So bigger reputation means a bigger salary, but all else being equal, if you have someone who has all of the actual same skills in terms of developing your players with a poor reputation, from my perspective, that's the person you want to hire, since you're getting the same amount of skill, potentially at a lower price point. And they also acknowledge that coaches can develop better skills as they get more experience. So when you start out with that low reputation person, if they do a good job and your team is successful and they get more experience, that's what's going to lead to better skills down the road for some of those less experienced hires that you may make today. And one of the things that I've experienced time to time in the game is you go to try to make a free agent signing, and the free agent tells you that his personality clashes with your manager and he won't sign with your team for that reason. This tutorial gets a little bit into those personality clashes. Doesn't explain exactly what drives them. My assumption is that even for players, they have in the background personality works well with and struggles with, similar to coaches assigned to them. And there will be times when they just don't mesh with your manager based on that background personality. And that unfortunately is going to mean that a player that you had hoped to sign may not be able to join your team unless you want to get rid of your manager. The tutorial also gets into the specialization of pitching and hitting coaches. Just to be clear, they do say this doesn't mean the coach is only good at this one particular topic. It just means that they excel in that particular focus, whether it's, in the case of hitting, contact, power, patience. Contact means that the hitting coach is going to be better than teaching contact-oriented batters, but he's still normal in everything else. And they do a good job in this tutorial of outlining the difference between handles development and influences mechanics, which are two critical factors for both your manager and your bench coach. Essentially, handling development is how good the coach is at helping players to realize their potential. Whereas when you're talking about influencing mechanics, that is essentially how good this coach is at identifying and exploiting untapped potential. They talk about the talent change randomness. So essentially, development is meeting all of the developed skills that you think the player can potentially meet based on the way they're currently rated by your scout. If someone is good in mechanics, that may actually allow your players to expand their abilities further and develop new ratings or skills. So obviously both are critical, but a pretty good explanation of the difference between development and mechanics in this tutorial. And they spell it out real specifically here. Influencing mechanics is a way to give your team the best chance at having positive TCR changes and development for your players, and prioritize it with your manager and bench coaches, as it's not going to be as important for other coaches. And similarly, they do a good job explaining you're teaching catching, infield, outfield defense, and running, which is what your bench coaches, your first base coaches, and your third base coaches are going to focus on. If you have people that are very good in those aspects, that's going to improve the chance that you will get TCR increases in your defensive skills and your running skills for the players in your major league organization. And this 8th tutorial also gets into the relationships that all of the people on your staff have with the players on their teams. And they do note that in the situations where you have poor relationships, that's going to potentially have very diminished development results. So even if you have a great pitching coach and who's a power pitching type of coach, and you've got a great young prospect who's a power pitching prospect, if you happen to look and see that that relationship is poor, might be time to make a change, because that player is not going to progress as well as he possibly could because of the difficulty in that relationship with the coach. And the folks at OOTP explain that point really well here. Make sure to watch out for coaching staff members who have bad relationships with the players that they're managing or coaching. This can put a potential reduction to your coach's ability to develop or help your players. And on to tutorial 9, which is player development and scouting. This is another one that I found pretty useful. A lot of good little reminders in here, which I'll try to summarize for you. Some of it may be new information. A lot of it may be stuff that you're either familiar with or forgot, but this is probably a good one to spend a little time with if you're looking for one where there's a lot of good nuggets to pull out of it. And they kick off this tutorial with some good information about the player development budget. And they do note that technically there is no maximum amount for this budget. But they do say you're going to see better chances for good player development going from 8 million to 24 million. And you're going to see very minimal improvements once you get over $35 million and upwards. And they make the point that, this prevents the Dodgers and the Yankees and the other big market teams from just being able to buy their way to the best results. So it is a situation where in the player development budget there are definitely diminishing returns as you add more and more money into that budget. And this tutorial also does a good job describing exactly what scouting means. The more money you put into your scouting budget, it's going to help you to be more accurate and also work faster. So if you've got more money in the budget, those are the times when you're preparing to make a trade before the trade deadline or getting ready for the start of free agency, and you've got a bunch of reports that you want to pull. If you've got more money in your scouting budget, those reports that you get back are going to come back quicker and more accurate for the more money that you put into that scouting budget. And similarly to the amount of the total scouting budget, you've got the ability to change your sliders and the allocations to major league, minor league, amateur, and international scouting. Similar theme is that they know in the higher your amateur scouting budget is, you're going to get a more accurate review and a more quick review of those players, hopefully setting you up for more successful amateur drafts each season. And international scouting is an area that I generally like to focus a good amount of my budget on, and they confirm here that the more money you spend on scouting in general, and then the bigger your slider is to the right on international scouting, the higher potential quality of scouting discoveries you're going to have. So if you want to be having more of those random 3 and 4 star potential players going into your international academy, you're going to want to be spending as much as possible on your scouting budget and as much as possible in the allocation to international scouting to increase the likelihood that that will happen for you. And they make the important point here, particularly for small market teams, that that's beneficial because the scouting discoveries that you make on the international level are instantly yours to keep and develop, and you don't need to pay a signing bonus, and you don't need to make a draft pick to acquire them. And this tutorial also does a good job of kind of confirming the conventional views about scouts that favor ability versus scouts that favor tools. Scouts that favor ability, as many know, that's going to take into weight more how the player has actually performed, and that their stats that they have put up so far are going to have more influence on how the scout views that player. And they note that a highly favoring ability scout is going to be less likely to put 5 stars or extremely high potential ratings onto a prospect until they've actually proven through their stats that they can actually achieve that ability. And in contrast, the highly flavored tools scout is going to do the opposite and project players based primarily on what their potential rating ceilings are. So favoring tools gives you the best peak performance ratings a player that could get. So as others have kind of explained and articulated over the years, if you have a highly favorability type of scout, you're going to probably ultimately find more good solid major leaguers. Highly favor tools is going to probably let you identify more real superstars, but you're also going to, end up missing on some players that you think were going to be superstars that just don't ever actually develop to that level. And the last item this tutorial covers is the scouting task list, and just another reminder that how much budget you put into your scouting is going to dictate how quickly and accurately your scouts will work. So as with anything, you have to balance the budget when you're talking about player development and scouting, but every little bit extra that you can put into those budgets is going to pay dividends for your team until you kind of get to the point of diminishing returns on player development or the maximum scouting budget allowed. And the 10th and final tutorial covers contracts. This is one that I think is very good for newer players. If you are an experienced player of OOTP, probably not going to get as much out of this. If you spent a lot of time signing players to various types of contracts over the years, not really a lot of new ground in here. But if you want a better understanding of the different types of options and clauses and contract incentives that are available, definitely worth spending some time with this final tutorial. And as I mentioned, this tutorial spends a lot of time on incentives, options, and clauses that can be put into the contracts. Again, if you're an experienced player, but you're probably not going to pick up tons here. If you're newer to the game, though, definitely recommend this. Talk a good amount around the advantages and disadvantages of top-heavy, front-loaded contracts versus bottom-heavy, back-loaded contracts, vesting options, player options, team options, no-trade clauses, promised roles, and incentives. So a lot of detail in this one that I think is probably pretty useful to people that are newer to the game. And that, for what it's worth, is my summary of the 10 new tutorials in OOTP23. As I talked about, I think they're going to be very valuable for newer players to the game, and there were a few good reminders in there for me. Hopefully, some of the reminders that I shared with you were useful to you and/or encouraged you to maybe go through some of the tutorials yourself. If everything that I talked about was obvious review to you and nothing new and groundbreaking, then that's probably a pretty good sign that you don't need to spend any time with the tutorials. But hopefully this was a more efficient way of figuring that out than actually going through all of them by yourself. Would love to hear your comments down below, hear what you're thinking about the new game, and whether this was useful or not. Thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.